On Titan, a person would not stand under a black sky with sunlight cutting straight through empty space. They would stand under an orange one. The air would be thick with haze, the light would be dim, the horizon would look soft and distant, not sharp and airless like the moon. There could be clouds far away, there could be weather moving across the landscape, and for a moment Titan might almost feel less hostile than the places we usually imagine beyond Earth. That first impression is misleading. Titan does have an atmosphere. It does have pressure at the surface. In some ways, it gives you things the moon never could, but the air is mostly nitrogen with no breathable oxygen. The surface is around -179 degrees Celsius. Sunlight is so weak that a human base could not simply live from solar panels the way it might closer to the sun. So Titan is strange because it feels familiar in the wrong ways. It gives you a sky, but not air you can breathe. It gives you weather, but not warmth. It gives you pressure, but not safety. And that is where the real question begins. Not whether Titan looks more welcoming than an airless world. It does. The harder question is whether a human body and the habitat around it could stay alive there once every requirement is counted honestly. By the end of this video, you will understand why Titan can look almost familiar while still being a place where human life would have to be manufactured, protected, and defended almost every minute. If you enjoy exploring questions like this with me, subscribing helps others find the channel too. Sharing the video helps even more. Let's begin. The first thing Titan seems to offer is relief. If you picture a person stepping onto the moon, the obvious danger is immediate. There is no air outside the suit, no pressure, no buffer. The outside world is emptiness. Titan changes that picture at once. NASA describes a surface pressure of about 1.5 bar, higher than Earth's. A person standing on Titan would still die quickly without protection, but they would not be dying in vacuum. They would be inside air thick enough to carry sound, to make haze, and to press against the outside of a habitat wall. That feels like progress. It is progress, but it is progress in the wrong column. ESA's atmosphere summary is blunt about what that air actually is. Titan's atmosphere is dominated by nitrogen, with methane and other compounds mixed through it. For a human lung, that is the whole problem. The body does not care that the air is thick if the air contains no oxygen it can use. Breathing on Titan would be like taking deep breaths in a place where the pressure is real, the weather is real, the sky is real, and none of it can enter your bloodstream in the way life requires. That difference matters because people often fold several survival questions into one image. They see air and assume breathing, temperature moderation, and some partial version of habitability all arrive together. On Earth, they do arrive together. The same atmosphere that presses on the body also carries oxygen, water vapor, clouds, and heat. Titan breaks that bundle apart. It gives you pressure without lungs, weather without biology, and a horizon without welcome. NASA's environmental control and life support overview helps make the separation clearer. A human habitat is not only a shell that keeps a crew away from danger, it is an active system that manages oxygen, carbon dioxide, pressure, circulation, temperature, water, and waste at the same time. On Titan, the outside pressure might reduce some engineering strain compared with a vacuum world. The habitat wall is not facing total emptiness. Suit decompression logic changes. Airlock operations change. Some structural burdens soften, but the central burden does not soften. Breathable air still has to be created, stored, monitored, and protected by machinery. That means the first unfiltered breath on Titan would not feel like opening a visor in mountain air. It would feel like entering the wrong chemistry entirely. The body could still perform the motion of breathing. Air would move. The chest would rise. Yet the useful exchange would fail at the precise point life depends on it. Oxygen would not be crossing into the blood in the amount a human body needs. The body would be burning through its remaining usable oxygen while surrounded by an atmosphere that cannot replace it. The pressure advantage is easiest to understand as a suit and habitat design advantage, not as a life advantage. A surface habitat does not need to face bare vacuum on the far side of its wall. A crew stepping through an airlock is not stepping into emptiness, yet the inside atmosphere still has to be close to a human one, and the outside atmosphere is still useless for breathing. So the base cannot ever treat the external air as a reserve, a relief valve, or a partial backup. The gap between inside and outside remains absolute even when the pressure gap is smaller. That would shape ordinary routines more than people expect. A crew could perhaps hear wind move around the habitat, watch haze drift across the horizon, or see dunes and lakes under a sky that no longer looks like open space. Yet every SEAL inspection would still matter as much as it does in vacuum. The outside world would be full of air and still offer no mercy for a failed helmet ring, a damaged hose, or a contaminated intake. Titan's atmosphere changes the look of exposure. It does not soften the biological penalty for exposure. In that sense, the moon behaves like a polite liar. It gives the body environmental cues that sound familiar while withholding the one atmospheric service the body truly needs. That means Titan does not let humans move from a life support problem to an exploration problem. It forces the life support problem to stay in the room from the first minute. Every walk outside still begins inside a fully artificial breathing environment. Every return home still depends on a habitat that has made oxygen available, carried away carbon dioxide, and held the air composition inside a narrow band the body can survive. This is where the phrase thick air does most of its misleading work. On Earth, thick air can feel protective because it usually arrives as part of a larger package. It belongs to weather. It softens radiation exposure compared with open space. It lets wings bite into something real, and it lets exposed fluids behave normally. Titan keeps some of that package while removing the one service humans need most. The result is a world that looks closer while remaining completely sealed off. A person might stand under that orange sky and feel the outside pressing gently on a suit, yet the same person would still be carrying their entire breathable world on their back or behind them in a habitat. There is another quiet shift here as well. The survival question stops being, can the body be exposed to this world, and becomes, how much of the body's normal environment can engineering replace every minute? Vacuum worlds make the first question obvious. Titan hides it behind a more familiar surface picture. The body still needs oxygen pressure at the lungs, stable temperature, safe carbon dioxide levels, clean water, and a chain of maintenance that never breaks. Titan only changes which part of the problem feels dramatic. That is why the honest comparison is not Earth-like versus alien. The honest comparison is vacuum hazard versus chemistry hazard. The moon kills with emptiness. Titan kills with the wrong atmosphere. On one world, the outside offers nothing. On the other, it offers something that looks almost useful until you ask the only question that matters. Can a person breathe it? No. There is a psychological consequence here too. On the moon, danger is obvious enough that people instinctively respect it. Titan invites a moment of false trust because the environment looks inhabited even when it is not inhabitable. The sky is not black. The outside world has weather and texture. A listener can imagine standing there longer than they should. That is part of why Titan is such a good test case. It shows how quickly the human mind confuses environmental familiarity with biological permission. That confusion would shape behavior as much as engineering. A crew on Titan would still follow strict protocol, but the emotional feel of the world matters. Hearing wind outside a wall is different from hearing nothing. Seeing haze roll across a horizon is different from seeing bare vacuum. Those familiar cues could make the environment feel as though it is participating in life, when it is really only decorating the absence of life. Titan teaches that habitability is not the same thing as atmospheric theatre. It also reveals how much Earth's atmosphere normally does for us, without asking to be noticed. On Earth, the same medium that presses gently on the body is also the medium that feeds the blood, carries weather, moderates heat, and lets ordinary fire, agriculture, and outdoor work exist at all. Titan keeps the visual half of that bargain and discards the biological half. That split is what makes its air so deceptive. It is present enough to look useful and wrong enough to stay lethal. That is why early human life on Titan would probably be shaped by caution, not adaptation. The crew would learn very quickly that the outside atmosphere can be heard, seen and felt on a suit without ever becoming part of the body's support system. That repeated mismatch would shape every walk, every emergency drill, and every intuitive judgment about risk. The world would keep acting familiar in ways that matter less, and unfamiliar in the way that matters most. It would also shape the emotional language people use about the place. On Titan, the phrase outside air would be literally true and biologically useless at the same time. That contradiction captures the moon better than most slogans do. The air is there. It simply refuses the one partnership with life that human beings mean when they talk about air as support rather than scenery. And once that answer lands, Titan's first gift stops looking like the foundation of survival and starts looking like a limited engineering advantage wrapped around a fully hostile chemistry. The next correction is even harder because the air on Titan is not merely unbreathable, it is cold enough to turn the whole world into a thermal threat. The number that governs Titan is not its distance from Saturn, or the color of its haze, or the size of its seas. It is 94 Kelvin. NASA's Titan facts page puts the surface temperature near -179 degrees Celsius. Cassini temperature work, cited in NASA's technical archive, keeps the same basic picture. Titan does not wander around the edge of freezing. It sits in a cryogenic range, with seasonal and regional changes measured in only a few Kelvin. That is a useful scientific detail, but for survival it means something simple. Titan is not a cold place with warmer corners. It is a world where the baseline itself is severe enough to reshape every system that touches it. People hear very cold so often in space documentaries that the words begin to flatten out. Mars is cold, the moon is cold at night, deep space is cold. Titan needs a different mental picture. The surface there is close to temperatures used in laboratories to think about cryogenic behavior. Materials stiffen, fluids behave differently. Seals, lubricants, batteries, and electronics all stop living in ordinary conditions. A door opening is no longer only a pressure event. It is a heat leak into a place that is always waiting to take the heat away. That is why Titan's cold cannot remain scenery. On a vacuum world, outside work is dangerous partly because a suit must create pressure and temperature by itself, while also shielding a person from radiation and micrometeoroids. On Titan, outside work remains dangerous, but the character of the danger shifts. The atmosphere is there, the pressure is there, yet every exposed surface, every line carrying fluid, every tool left out too long, and every joint that cycles between warm and cold is paying a thermal price. The Cassini surface temperature results add an important twist. Titan's cold is steady. The seasonal swing is not enough to turn the environment into something forgiving. That stability sounds gentle on first hearing because we associate steady weather with manageability. Here it means there is no noon thaw and no warm part of the day waiting to help a technician. But stability at 94 Kelvin is the stability of a locked freezer, not the stability of a mild climate. The environment is relentless because it does not offer relief. It does not drift toward a range where ordinary maintenance becomes easier. Think about what that means for a habitat. The first image most people carry is a sealed warm room. That image is useful, but it is too small. A Titan habitat would not be one warm room inside a cold desert. It would be an always heated chain of spaces where the human body, the water system, the medical supplies, the food stores, the plumbing, the electronics, and whatever agriculture exists are all being held above the temperature of the world around them by active effort. The base is not just keeping people comfortable, it is continuously resisting a cryogenic outside environment that never stops leaning on it. NASA's life support framing helps again here. Oxygen, water, waste, circulation, and safety are not separate luxuries. They are interlocked. Cold pushes on all of them at once. Water storage becomes a thermal question. Waste handling becomes a thermal question. Condensation control becomes a thermal question. The simple act of moving between inside and outside becomes a thermal question because each airlock cycle exports energy and invites cold into systems that want stability. If you picture one ordinary human day inside such a base, the cold starts showing up in places that barely count as drama. It appears in a water line that cannot be allowed to drift out of range, in a medical freezer that must stay on the correct side of failure, and in a hatch seal that grows a little more fragile each time it cycles. Even indoor air has to be moved through surfaces and volumes that are constantly losing heat to the outside. The crew would not be living in a place that occasionally becomes dangerously cold. They would be living in a place where every comfortable room exists only because dangerous cold is being pushed back continuously. That changes the meaning of small mistakes. On Earth, a door left open too long is usually wasteful. On Titan, the same habit can become part of a chain that stresses heaters, pumps, and stores of thermal reserve somewhere else in the base. A leak in a crop bay is not only a crop problem, it can become a water problem, a condensation problem, and then a power problem if more heat has to be moved into the space. The cold is so deep that nothing warm in the habitat gets to remain isolated. Every protected volume is borrowing safety from the same finite system. The effect runs all the way down to routine work. If a panel outside fails, the repair immediately widens. The crew has to ask how long a person can operate outdoors before the suit pays too high a cost, what repeated cycling between warm storage and cryogenic exposure is doing to tools, and whether a hinge, sensor, or line that works today will still work after hundreds of such trips. Titan's cold is not a dramatic event that strikes once. It is an invisible tax charged to every action. This is one reason thick air does not rescue habitability. On Earth, atmosphere helps smooth temperature change. Air and water move heat around. Seasons and weather live inside a thermal range that biology evolved within. Titan has atmosphere too, but it carries a cryogenic climate rather than moderating one into human usefulness. The same haze that makes the sky look gentle exists above ground cold enough to turn water ice into something more like stone. There is no natural reset built into that environment. On Earth, systems can fail and still remain inside a world where liquid water, moderate air, and outside labor are possible. On Titan, a failure in heating or thermal isolation is not only a loss of comfort, it can begin pulling several other systems out of their safe range at once. A habitat may keep functioning for a while, but it is functioning on borrowed order. The outside world is always ready to reclaim it. This is why cryogenic cold changes the meaning of repair. On Earth, technicians often work against inconvenience, delay, and cost. On Titan, technicians would sometimes be working against a countdown set by physics. A component that cools too far is not simply waiting patiently for attention. It may be moving toward brittleness, viscosity changes, or knock-on losses elsewhere in the system. The environment is calm in appearance and impatient in effect. The deeper point is that Titan does not contain a hidden mild layer beneath the first impression of cold. Cold is the layer. It is the background reality out of which every safe room and every breathable volume have to be carved. Once that lands, the moon stops sounding like a cold place we could adapt to casually and starts sounding like a cryogenic world we could only survive by sustained refusal. That refusal would have to be cultural as well as mechanical. Crews would need routines built around conserving heat, protecting lines, staging repairs, and respecting the fact that almost any lapse in thermal discipline can spread into another system before anyone outside the base can help. Titan does not merely ask for good insulation, it asks for a daily way of living that never forgets the number 94 Kelvin for very long. That number would sit behind ordinary language the way weather sits behind ours. People inside the base might not say it every hour. They would still be living inside it every hour. Every design choice, every reserve calculation, every decision about external work, and every idea about local resource use would eventually bend back toward the same physical fact. Titan is cold enough that it gets a vote in almost every human plan. So the meaningful shift here is not that Titan is colder than expected. It is that cold becomes the master constraint under which every other piece of the survival puzzle has to operate. Air can be made, water can be processed, food can be grown, medicine can be brought, but all of it has to be done inside a machine that never gets to stop fighting the temperature outside. And once cold is understood that way, power and heat stop sounding like supporting systems. They become the center of the habitat story. When engineers talk about power in space, people often imagine electricity first. Lights, computers, radios, pumps, motors. On Titan, power has to do something more primitive before it does any of those things. It has to hold on to warmth. NASA's page on radioisotope power systems makes a point that matters here. Far from the sun, in harsh cold environments, these systems are valuable not only because they provide steady electrical output, they also provide heat. That is one reason they have been used on outer solar system missions. Warmth is not a side effect in those places. It is part of what keeps machines alive long enough to do anything useful. The Dragonfly mission makes this concrete. NASA and NASA Astrobiology both describe Dragonfly as a Titan rotorcraft powered by a radioisotope system, not by sunlight gathered from the surface. The reason is not mysterious. Titan sits far from the sun under a hazy atmosphere in a cryogenic environment. A robotic explorer going there is designed from the start around the fact that it cannot expect the surface to behave like a bright, easy solar worksite. That does not tell us how to power a human base. It tells us something more basic. Titan is the kind of environment where even a robot needs an energy source that doubles as a thermal lifeline. Now scale that logic up. Dragonfly is one machine. A human habitat is an ecosystem of machines, volumes, supplies, bodies, and buffers. Air has to circulate. Water has to remain liquid where humans need it liquid. Crops, if there are any, have to remain in a narrow living range. Batteries, medical systems, and stored materials all need their own protected conditions. Waste has to be processed. Pipes cannot simply become whatever temperature the outside world wants them to become. Every hour of operation is therefore a heating problem and a power problem at the same time. That makes thermal design less like insulation around a house and more like circulation through an organ. Heat has to be generated, moved, held, and reused. Warm machinery may help warm adjacent systems. Waste heat may stop being waste. Interior layout begins to matter because some rooms want tighter thermal stability than others. A greenhouse, a sleeping area, a medical corner, and an equipment bay do not all ask for the same conditions. Titan forces a base to become deliberate about warmth at a level Earth buildings rarely have to think about. This changes the emotional center of the Titan question. People often imagine extreme worlds in terms of outside exposure. Can you step there? Could you stand there? Would the suit work? Those are real questions, but the main burden on Titan may not be the seconds outside. It may be the years inside. The habitat must act like a furnace, an air plant, a water plant, a farm support system, a clinic, and a repair shop all at once, in a place where losing heat is not an inconvenience, but a route toward total systems failure. NASA technical work tied to Dragonfly thermal analysis reinforces this point in a quieter way. Titan operations require Titan-specific thermal modeling. You do not simply take a design that worked elsewhere and assume the environment will forgive your shortcuts. Even at robotic scale, the world demands careful accounting. Surfaces, temperatures, heat flows, and operational cycles all matter because the environment does not absorb mistakes kindly. For humans, that means the habitat must be designed around bad days, not only ideal days. What happens if exterior maintenance takes longer than planned? What happens if a storage compartment cools more than expected? What happens if power has to be rerouted and one section of the base loses thermal margin. On Titan, those questions are not engineering pessimism. They are part of daily honesty. A warm living environment exists only because someone thought about how the base survives the moments when warmth is hardest to keep. The base would also need to treat heat as a shared resource rather than a room-by-room convenience. One section might be using machinery that throws off useful warmth, while another section is fragile enough to need tighter control. Waste heat from one process might become part of the survival plan for another. Titan encourages that kind of thinking because throwing warmth away casually would be like throwing away part of your air supply. The moon does not simply ask for insulation, it asks for a thermal economy. A human base would inherit that same logic, only with bodies inside the loop. It also inherits another hard truth. Heating a habitat is not like heating one room in a house. The heat has to keep breathing air viable. It has to keep water systems functioning. It has to protect medicines, electronics, and food storage. If a part of the base runs cooler than planned, the consequence may not be discomfort. It may be damage, contamination, or loss of function in another linked system. Warmth becomes infrastructure because it quietly underwrites every other piece of infrastructure. You can feel that more clearly if you shrink the picture down to one ordinary night. A crew goes to sleep, lights dim, exterior wind keeps moving through orange haze that nobody outside can enjoy directly. Inside, pumps still run, air still moves, water loops still circulate. A greenhouse still needs its own protected range. A storage bay still has to stay above the point where seals, liquids, or electronics begin drifting into the wrong regime. The base never becomes a passive shelter resting inside a cold landscape. It remains a warm process holding its shape against that landscape all the way through the night. That is why Titan pushes survival towards systems maturity rather than heroic toughness. You do not beat the environment by being brave for one repair shift. You beat it by building a thermal regime so stable that courage is needed only rarely. That requirement changes what counts as success. A base is not impressive because it can get hot on command. It is impressive because it can stay predictably warm without wasting precious margin, because it can route heat where it is needed, and because it can survive the little asymmetries that become disasters only after hours of neglect. In that sense, warmth on Titan starts to resemble pressure hull integrity in deep water. You do not notice it most when it is present. You notice it when the whole structure has been designed around the fact that it cannot be absent. The best Titan habitat would likely feel uneventful from the inside for exactly that reason. The more ordinary the indoor experience becomes, the more extraordinary the hidden thermal discipline must be, and that hidden discipline belongs near the center of any honest answer. Surviving on Titan would not mainly feel like enduring spectacular danger every minute. It would feel like living inside an artificial normality that has to be rebuilt by systems every minute. The drama would be quiet, repetitive, and technical. That is one reason Titan is such a hard place for casual settlement language to describe honestly. This is why Titan punishes casual optimism. The outside picture can still tempt you. Thick haze, a sheltered horizon, lower apparent exposure than the moon. But the deeper survival logic says something colder. A human presence on Titan would depend on a machine that cannot simply be pressurized and sealed. It has to remain warm through every day, every maintenance cycle, every imported component, every crop tray, every medical emergency, and every moment when the outside environment tries to pull energy away. If the base ever becomes routine in the minds of its crew, Titan would punish that routine quickly. Heat on Titan is not the background state, it is the achievement. That is the difference between a world that merely needs shelter and a world that demands active survival infrastructure at all times. Power, then, is not the budget that lets life become comfortable later. It is the budget that prevents life from stopping. That is also why Titan's real environmental advantage has to be described carefully. The dense atmosphere likely helps with radiation shielding. It does not erase the fact that the base would still be chained to a power and heat problem that never sleeps. Titan deserves one honest point before we go any further. A thick atmosphere is not only misleading, it is also useful. NASA's human radiation materials make the basic principle clear. On Earth, living things benefit from atmospheric shielding and, more broadly, from the protective environment built by atmosphere and magnetic context. Titan has no Earth-like biosphere and no Earth-like climate, but it does have something airless worlds do not. It has a substantial atmospheric blanket above the surface. That alone makes it reasonable to say Titan should offer better surface shielding than a place like the Moon, where almost nothing stands between a habitat wall and the external environment. That matters. We should grant it plainly. Space settlement talk often circles the same fear first. Radiation. People know that deep space is dangerous, and they know that the Moon and Mars lack Earth's full protection, so when they hear that Titan has thick air, the mind jumps. Better shielding, better safety, better place to live. The first step in that chain is sound. The rest of the chain is where the mistake begins. NASA's Human Research Program is useful here because it refuses to treat radiation as the whole story. NASA's 5 Hazards of Human Spaceflight framework puts radiation beside altered gravity, isolation and confinement, hostile closed environments, and distance from Earth. That list is not bureaucratic decoration. It is a reminder that survival is a ledger. Improving one line does not pay off the rest automatically. It also tells us something about attention. Radiation gets public attention because it is invisible, frightening, and easy to summarize. But a remote base is often more likely to feel the pressure of isolation, environmental control, and system fragility hour by hour. A crew could benefit from better shielding and still spend most of its real effort dealing with air quality, thermal stability, medical caution, and maintenance risk. In other words, the hazard people talk about first may not be the hazard the habitat works hardest against. That mismatch matters because it shapes bad comparisons. A world can win the radiation comparison and still lose the habitability comparison by a wide margin. If the air is wrong, the heat budget unforgiving, the power thin, the food artificial, and the gravity uncertain, then better shielding only means one part of the disaster has become quieter. It does not mean the place has become kind. Titan may help on radiation compared with an airless world. It does not help on oxygen. It does not help on cryogenic temperature. It does not help on weak sunlight. It does not help on low gravity uncertainty. It does not help on delayed rescue. In some of those categories, it makes the situation harsher. So the right way to use radiation in this story is as a narrowed advantage, not a broad verdict. You can feel the temptation in the numbers people wish they had. If only there were a clean Titan surface dose figure, then perhaps the world could be sorted into friendly or hostile. But that is not how the human problem works. Even a low radiation habitat can fail through hypoxia, thermal loss, medical isolation, or gravity-driven decline. A person does not survive because one invisible threat has been reduced if the oxygen loop still fails, the food system still demands too much power, or the body still spends years below any gravity we can confidently call healthy. This is why Titan solves the wrong famous problem first. The danger most people already know how to fear is the one Titan partly softens. The dangers that dominate its real habitability are slower, less cinematic, and more deeply woven into daily operations. A habitat wall under orange haze may be better shielded than a habitat wall on bare lunar regolith. That does not make the habitat self-sustaining. It makes one term in the cost of sustaining it less severe. There is another reason to stay disciplined here. If Titan's shielding advantage is overstated, the whole argument begins sliding toward the wrong promise. Safer than Mars, friendlier than the Moon, closer to livable than people think. Those are broader claims than the evidence supports, and they drag the piece away from its real strength. Titan is interesting precisely because it feels safer in one celebrated way while becoming more punishing in several others that turn out to matter more. There is also the journey to remember. Titan's atmosphere may protect the surface to some degree, but that atmosphere is not wrapped around the crew during the long travel phase from Earth. A human mission would still have to survive deep space transit before it ever arrived at the better shielded part of the story. So even Titan's best environmental term helps only after many other mission risks have already been paid. Even after arrival, that advantage would probably feel quieter than people imagine. A crew is not likely to wake each morning thinking first about the atmospheric shielding above their roof. They are more likely to think about whether power margins remain healthy, whether the water loop is clean, whether low gravity is wearing on their bodies, and whether a delayed answer from Earth can be afforded if something looks wrong. Shielding matters. It simply does not dominate lived experience the way popular space talk trains us to expect. It may help to picture the difference in bodily terms. Radiation is the kind of threat people imagine as something descending from the sky. Thermal loss, bad air, and system fragility are the kinds of threats a crew would feel in the texture of daily life. One is the danger above the habitat, the others are the dangers inside it. Titan improves the first more than the second. That is why the Moon can be defensible in a narrow radiation comparison and still remain a poor home by the measures that structure a normal human day. The same narrowing applies to the mission as a whole. Better shielding at the surface says nothing about the long chain of transit, training, redundancy and maintenance required to reach the surface in the first place. A world does not become hospitable because arrival is less punishing than expected if everything after arrival still depends on imported air, imported medicine, imported expertise, and a base that must stay thermally and biologically perfect. That shift is also good science writing. It teaches the listener to stop asking for one headline metric and start asking which requirements dominate when everything is counted together. Radiation belongs in that full count. It is not the sum of it. Once we hold that line, the next pressure point comes into focus. Titan's atmosphere may shield. Its distance from the Sun still starves the surface of easy energy. And on Titan, every shortage of energy becomes a shortage of warmth as well. At Earth, sunlight can be treated as a given so often that we stop noticing how much of life quietly leans on it. Titan breaks that habit. NASA's Titan Facts page states the contrast in the bluntest useful way. Sunlight at Titan is roughly 100 times fainter than at Earth. Even before you think about haze, weather, angle, or collection efficiency, the basic energy arriving from the Sun is already deeply reduced by distance. Titan lives in a dim outer system economy where light is not absent, but abundance is. That matters to humans for a simple reason. If power becomes expensive, then every support system built on power becomes expensive with it. On Titan, that is almost everything that counts. Dragonfly again serves as a clue rather than a shortcut. NASA's descriptions of the mission show a vehicle built around radioisotope power, not around the assumption that Titan's surface can feed a generous solar budget. That choice does not prove anything about human settlement by itself. It does show that when engineers have to build a real machine for Titan, they do not begin with the cheerful intuition that the Sun will do most of the work. For a human habitat, the consequences are broader than they first appear. Power sits underneath nearly every human function in the habitat. It runs atmosphere control, keeps water moving through purification, supports waste handling, and circulates heat so the base does not drift toward the outside temperature. It also lights working spaces, sustains whatever agriculture exists, and keeps communications, diagnostics, fabrication tools, and medical systems alive. Weak sunlight is therefore not a single engineering inconvenience. It is a multiplier placed on every later problem in the habitat. That means energy storage and reserve capacity matter almost as much as generation. A Titan crew could not live happily on a system that only works when every component performs exactly as expected. The base would need margin. It would need spare capacity for maintenance periods, for damaged hardware, for crop cycles, and for medical surprises. A strong power source is only the start. The real achievement is a power ecology robust enough to absorb trouble without immediately threatening the conditions of life. This is where comparisons with Mars start to mislead people. Mars is cold, hostile, and difficult, but a Mars base can at least imagine a serious relationship with sunlight. Dust storms complicate it. Distance complicates it. But the sun still has presence there in a way Titan does not inherit. On Titan, the daylight is dim to begin with, and the atmosphere that gives the moon its visual softness also helps turn surface solar optimism into a poor bargain. That does not mean nuclear solves Titan. It means the baseline intuition has to change. Power sources that work there would not merely be purchases or modules. They would be survival personalities built into the whole settlement. The crew would learn which systems can tolerate interruption, which cannot, which reserves are real, and which apparent reserves are already spoken for by heating, diagnostics, or food stability. Titan turns electrical planning into a social fact because everybody in the habitat ends up living inside the same margin. A settlement fantasy often treats power like an input that can be scaled once enough ambition arrives. Titan forces a tighter view. The energy system has to be steady, redundant, and tolerant of failure. It has to survive long, cold stretches because Titan is always long and always cold. It has to support life support and thermal control simultaneously. And because the habitat would be so distant from rapid help, the margin for cascading failure matters more than it would in near-Earth orbit or even on shorter duration missions. NASA's radioisotope power framing is useful again because it ties harsh conditions and distance together. We use these systems when sunlight is weak, when reliability matters, and when the environment punishes interruptions. That is a clean description of Titan itself. If a small robotic mission leans on that logic, a human outpost would need an even harder version of the same discipline. More redundancy, more heat management, more maintenance, more ability to survive the loss of a component without losing the habitat. And power scarcity would be felt in human rhythm, not only in engineering spreadsheets. How bright can living spaces be kept? How much crop area can be supported at once? How much spare heating can be wasted during repairs? How much equipment can run together without eating into emergency margin? Titan turns those quiet questions into daily governance. A base there would not simply produce energy, it would ration trust in its own energy system every day of its existence. That is a different psychological world from Earth. Here, the sun arrives whether we manage it well or not. On Titan, usable energy would feel more like a substance stored inside the settlement than a free condition outside it. Growth would therefore always carry suspicion. A new laboratory rack, a larger greenhouse, or a more capable medical bay might all be desirable. But each one would also be another claim on a finite power system already defending the crew from the cold. Titan makes ambition expensive in watts before it makes it expensive in money. This is also why Titan's surface beauty can become an intellectual trap. The orange haze, the low light, the seas and rain all make the moon feel like a world with weather instead of a dead rock. But weather does not supply the energy a human system needs. A dim sky can be atmospheric and still be energy poor. Titan's false friendliness comes partly from that confusion. The world feels less exposed, so the mind starts granting it hidden abundance. In fact, one of its deepest pressures is scarcity, and scarcity here does not arrive alone. On Titan, a watt rarely gets to do only one thing. The same energy that runs a process is often defending a temperature, preserving a machine from freezing, and protecting tomorrow's survival margin while it serves today's immediate needs. Imagine what that means during a repair week rather than a perfect week. A heater fails in one wing. Lighting in the plant room cannot be run at its ideal level while technicians work on the fault. Diagnostics pull extra power. Extra heat has to be moved into a compartment that was not supposed to need it. Suddenly the energy system is not only feeding life, it is arbitrating between one survival priority and another. That is the kind of choice weak sunlight makes more severe. The habitat can still endure it, but only if its power budget was designed with enough humility to expect days when routine turns expensive. The same logic applies to growth. It is easy to sketch a future Titan base on paper and keep adding rooms, tools, laboratories, and agriculture until it starts to resemble a town. In reality, each addition asks a harder question. Can the base still heat it? Can the base still light it? Can the base still preserve safe reserve if one generator path goes offline or one storage chain falls out of range? Power is not only what lets the settlement do more, it is what tells the settlement when more has become reckless. That is why Titan would make restraint part of engineering wisdom. A crew might want a larger farm, a better lab, a more comfortable common room, or more redundancy in every direction. Those desires are human and sensible. The energy budget would still force choices among them. On Titan, ambition would always have to survive an accounting exercise before it could become architecture. That pressure would shape politics inside the habitat as much as hardware. Every major upgrade would also be an argument about what other margin could be surrendered to pay for it. The dim sky outside would still be setting terms for social life inside. Titan turns available power into a kind of constitution written by distance, weak sunlight, and cold. That is brutal power math. It becomes even harder when we reach one of the most common frontier fantasies of all. People hear that Titan is covered in ice and ringed by lakes. Surely, they think, water cannot be the problem there. Titan has plenty of water if your definition of plenty is geological. It has far less if your definition is operational. NASA's Titan facts page makes the first part clear. Titan is built with enormous amounts of water ice. In the broad planetary sense, water is not missing from the Moon. But Titan's surface conditions change what that statement means. At 94 Kelvin, water ice is not behaving like a convenient human resource waiting to be scooped up and melted beside a campfire. In practical terms, it behaves more like stone locked inside a world that is cold enough to keep it locked. That distinction is easy to miss because on Earth, water abundance and water usability often travel together. If you see snow, ice, or a lake, you are looking at part of a hydrological system already close to the temperature and chemistry human life can work with. On Titan, the visual analogues betray you. The surface can show channels, lakes, shorelines, even rain, and still be offering the wrong liquid under the wrong conditions. ESA's Life on Titan page helps sharpen that correction. Titan's stable surface liquids are methane and ethane, not liquid water. The lakes are real, their usefulness to human biology is not. A shoreline on Titan does not mean hydration, irrigation, or local abundance in the ordinary sense. It means standing beside a chemical reservoir that proves the world is active while doing nothing to relieve the basic needs of a human body. This is why there is ice there is not the same sentence as water is easy there. For a habitat, usable water still has to be extracted, processed, warmed, stored, monitored, and recycled. NASA's life support materials bring the discussion back indoors again. Water is not only something a crew drinks, it is part of hygiene, food preparation, medical care, atmospheric control, and waste recovery. The more remote the mission, the more water has to behave like a controlled internal asset rather than an external convenience. Titan offers raw inventory, not immediate relief. That difference becomes easier to feel if we move from geology to routine life. A crew member does not need water on Titan in the abstract. They need clean, warm water to drink, to wash with, to sterilize equipment with, and to feed into every loop that keeps the base healthy. Those are daily needs, not planetary ones. Titan can satisfy the geologist's sentence and still leave the crew fully dependent on extraction, purification, recycling, and constant thermal control before a single cup is ready. That is why local abundance and usable abundance have to be kept apart. A scientist looking at Titan can point to a crust full of water ice and say the element is everywhere. A crew quartermaster has to ask a harsher question: how much energy, how much machine wear, And how much risk does it take to turn that buried or frozen inventory into liquid water inside the habitat today? On Titan, those answers remain expensive enough that the comforting phrase, "there is water there," becomes almost meaningless by itself. Even if future engineering found workable methods to obtain water from Titan's icy materials, that would not erase the energy burden. Ice in that environment has to be mined or processed under cryogenic conditions, then brought into a controlled system, then kept liquid and clean inside a warm base. The outside world does not hand over ready water. The habitat has to convert distant geology into daily biology. Water ice itself creates another false comfort. On Titan it is abundant enough to shape the crust, yet the same cold that preserves it also turns access into work. Mining, processing, transport and melting all become part of the water story. That means local water, even if technically available, still arrives on the crew side of the ledger as energy spent, hardware worn, and thermal stability risked. The moon is not handing out an easy river, it is hiding water inside a cryogenic operating problem. That difference becomes almost physical if you imagine one glass of water inside the habitat. On Earth, that glass is supported by rivers, clouds, reservoirs, pipes, treatment plants, and a planet whose ordinary temperature already keeps water in the right state. On Titan, the same glass would exist only because some chain of machines found water in the wrong place or recovered it from yesterday's use, warmed it, cleaned it, checked it, stored it, and protected it from a world ready to freeze it again. The distance between those two glasses is the distance between a living planet and an engineered refuge. The famous lakes deepen the same lesson. They are beautiful evidence that Titan is not static. They are chemically important. They may matter for science, for astrobiology, and for understanding prebiotic environments. But a human settlement cannot drink them, grow crops in them, or build a normal life around them. Their presence can even make the world feel more cruel because they resemble one of Earth's great supports of life while being fundamentally disconnected from the uses life needs. That is also why local resource optimism needs a boundary. Saying Titan has water somewhere inside its crust is true. Saying Titan therefore has easy local hydration is false. A survivable base might eventually reduce imports by processing local ice, but that reduction would arrive only after more mining, more equipment, more heat, more power, and more maintenance had already been added to the habitat's burden. The world gives you inventory, it does not give you relief. That distinction is important because survival stories often treat local resources as though discovering them is almost the same as using them. Titan keeps separating those steps. The water exists in the geological sense, but usefulness arrives only after machines have done the hard translation into a warm, clean indoor supply. That is the recurring pattern of the whole moon. Again and again, Titan offers the material and withholds the condition. You can point to ice, air, and weather, then discover that none of them arrive in the form a human body can immediately use. That repeated split is why the moon feels so close in imagination and so far in practice. You can see the broader pattern now. Titan keeps producing almost solutions, pressure that is not breathing, air that is not habitability, liquids that are not water in the human sense. Relief appears at the level of image and disappears at the level of function. For survival, that means water becomes another indoor system. It moves through purification hardware, it must be guarded against contamination, and it has to stay in forms the body can use while the outside world sits far below freezing. If agriculture exists, water becomes part of that loop too. If medicine exists, sterile water matters there as well. Every ordinary fluid assumption of Earth turns into a managed privilege inside the base. So Titan is not water poor in the elemental sense, it is water difficult in the human sense. And Titan's rich chemistry creates an even more seductive misunderstanding. If water is locked away and the lakes are made of hydrocarbons, some people start imagining a different shortcut. Maybe the moon can feed us chemically, if not hydrologically. It cannot. Titan is loaded with chemistry. Cassini showed methane and ethane lakes and seas, atmospheric haze, dunes rich in organic material, and a surface shaped by a methane cycle that can feel eerily familiar. NASA's Dragonfly mission exists partly because Titan is such an extraordinary laboratory for chemistry that may resemble stages of prebiotic Earth. That is a real scientific treasure. It is also exactly where human habitability talk can drift into fantasy if the words are not handled carefully. Organic does not mean edible. That needs to be said slowly because Earth trains us to hear organic chemistry and life as neighboring ideas. On Titan, the connection is much looser. Carbon-bearing molecules can exist in abundance without providing a breathable ecosystem, a food web, or any of the biological relationships human survival depends on. The Moon may be rich in raw ingredients for chemical processes and still be empty of anything a person could live on directly. NASA and NASA Astrobiology describe Dragonfly's scientific case in terms of habitability questions, prebiotic chemistry, and the conditions that may teach us about how life's ingredients behave. That phrasing is important. It does not say Titan is biologically ready for human use. It says Titan is valuable because it may preserve chemistry that helps us understand worlds before life. That is almost the opposite of a survival promise. It tells us the environment is scientifically rich, while staying biologically barren in the human sense. This is where the Moon's hydrocarbon wealth has to be put back in proportion. Yes, methane and other organics can be useful as feedstocks in some future industrial sense. Yes, chemistry matters for materials and fuels, but food is not a question of carbon alone. Food is a question of living systems that turn energy, water, nutrients, gas exchange, and time into stable, edible biology. Humans do not survive by being mere complex molecules. They survive inside functioning ecosystems or carefully engineered substitutes for ecosystems. That distinction gets sharper when you remember how selective biology really is. A crew does not need raw carbon in the abstract. It needs proteins, fats, carbohydrates, micronutrients, safe microbial relationships, and a way to keep all of those things reproducible across months and years. Titan's dunes and seas do not provide that. They provide chemically interesting surroundings that might help industry someday and scientific understanding immediately. The biological burden still remains indoors, under lights, inside warmth, using controlled water and carefully managed gases. NASA's life support and food production literature keeps the emphasis in the right place. Feeding a crew in space is not a foraging problem, it is a systems problem. It involves water, lighting, nutrient handling, contamination control, waste treatment, crew labor, and reliability. Titan's outside chemistry does not cancel those burdens. If anything, the oxygen-poor environment and the weak sunlight make them even more decisively indoor burdens. That is why Titan's organic richness can become one of the cruelest kinds of false hope. The landscape looks chemically alive. It is not biologically generous. A settlement window might show dunes, haze, and hydrocarbon weather, while the actual food security of the crew still depends on pumps, trays, reserves, nutrient stock, and the quiet health of organisms protected from everything outside. The Moon can look full and still be nutritionally empty. That emptiness also changes what abundance means. A place may be rich in molecules and poor in meals. It may be rich in scientific possibility and poor in biological support. Titan keeps making that distinction with unusual force. The more chemically interesting the exterior becomes, the more disciplined the interior still has to be if humans want to remain alive within it. So a Titan habitat cannot look at the surrounding world and think, the chemistry is already here, we are halfway to dinner. It has to think, the outside world gives us no edible ecology at all. Whatever food exists must be grown, protected, and recycled inside. That is a much harsher sentence. It also resists a common genre mistake. Many frontier stories treat resource presence as equivalent to survival support. Water somewhere means water for people. Carbon somewhere means fuel or food for people. A thick atmosphere somewhere means breathability for people. Titan keeps showing why those shortcuts fail. The moon is full of materials. The human question is whether those materials arrive in a form, place, and system that a fragile biological organism can actually use. In Titan's case, the answer keeps coming back no. Not from the air, not from the lakes, not from the chemistry itself. This is why the habitat now starts to look less like shelter and more like an artificial world. It cannot merely protect bodies from a dangerous outside. It has to replace nearly every invisible service Earth performs automatically. Air has to be made breathable. Water has to be kept usable. Food has to come from managed biology. Warmth has to be maintained. Waste has to be reworked into something survivable again. There is a practical side to that replacement that Titan's chemistry never removes. Even if hydrocarbons one day prove useful for industrial feedstocks, crews still need seed stock, nutrients, microbial control, and enough reliable power to keep indoor biology alive. A chemically interesting outside world can still leave the inside world doing all the biological work alone. That is what makes Titan scientifically rich and nutritionally empty at the same time. The human scale of that emptiness matters. A person can admire Titan's lakes and dunes through a window and still know that none of it is lunch, none of it is fresh air, and none of it is a field ready for planting. The moon may look full. For a living crew it remains ecologically blank. That ecological blankness also changes how hope is rationed. On some future world, people might dream of gradually using more of the local environment as part of daily life. Titan makes that dream narrow. You might use local materials in carefully engineered ways. You do not gradually step into a welcoming food web or breathable landscape. The line between the artificial interior and the useless exterior stays bright. Survival still happens on the habitat side of the glass, and among those services, one sits closest to the body's immediate survival. Oxygen. Oxygen. If you remove all the scenery from the Titan question, one hard fact stays behind. A human being there would live inside a manufactured atmosphere from the first breath to the last. NASA's environmental control and life support overview is dry reading, but that dryness is useful. It reminds us that breathable air is not a natural backdrop in spaceflight. Oxygen levels, carbon dioxide removal, circulation, pressure, humidity, trace contaminants, and fire safety all have to be actively managed. Near Earth, those systems already matter. On Titan, they become more central because the outside atmosphere can never help you. There is no partial backup, no outside air to clean up, no emergency step outside to breathe. That means Titan is not an oxygen storage problem. It is an oxygen industry problem. NASA technical work on oxygen recovery makes the point more concrete. Efforts to recover oxygen from metabolic carbon dioxide, including electrochemical systems and Bosch process development, are described as complex, heavy, and power-consuming. That language matters because it breaks a common fantasy. Closed life support does not mean a neat invisible machine in the corner doing one simple job forever. It means hardware chains, maintenance demands, energy costs, incomplete closure, and constant vigilance against failure. It also means the source of oxygen never becomes a trivial detail. Perhaps some oxygen begins as imported mass. Perhaps some could eventually come from processing water brought from Earth or extracted from local ice. In every case, the usable oxygen still has to pass through machinery, storage, and recovery logic before it becomes the air a crew safely breathes. Titan gives no free shortcut around that chain. It only increases the importance of making the chain efficient because replacing losses from Earth is so punishing. A habitat on Titan would feel that burden from two directions at once. First, it is far from Earth. Resupply is hard. Throwing away oxygen and replacing it casually becomes less tolerable the farther you travel. That is exactly why advanced recovery is pursued in deep space mission planning. Second, Titan is a cold, hostile environment where the systems performing this work have to remain warm, powered, and reliable inside a sealed base that cannot afford long outages. The outside air supplies pressure but no usable oxygen. The inside machines supply oxygen, but only as long as the base remains alive enough to run them. This changes the scale of the atmosphere problem. People often imagine breathing gear as a personal problem. Tanks, masks, filters. On Titan, those are only the outermost layer. The real breathing system is the habitat. It is the machinery that keeps oxygen available through sleep cycles, exercise, illness, crop fluctuations, equipment degradation, and every other variation a human community creates simply by being alive. A useful way to hear this is to imagine the opposite of Earth. On Earth, a person walks through a world where a planetary atmosphere has already done the hard work. The base unit of life is a free breath. On Titan, the base unit of life is a successfully running machine. If the machine stops, the atmosphere stops being human within that closed volume. That fact is quiet, but it dominates everything. It would dominate in ways the crew could feel without ever seeing the machinery directly. A slight rise in carbon dioxide is felt in headaches, fatigue, and bad concentration before it becomes an emergency. Humidity that drifts out of range can change comfort, contamination risk, and equipment behavior. A trace contaminant problem might begin as a smell, an irritation, or an ambiguous symptom. On Earth, we call these background conditions because the planet is doing the stabilizing. On Titan, they would be active outputs of the habitat, and every person in the base would be living inside the quality of those outputs all day. There is a second layer of fragility here. Atmospheres are not only about oxygen, they are about keeping oxygen high enough, carbon dioxide low enough, circulation active enough, and contamination controlled enough that the body remains healthy over time. A Titan base cannot simply hold some oxygen in reserve and call the problem solved. It has to keep the whole indoor air ecology in balance. Breathing becomes an ongoing industrial process, not a stockpile. That makes the air system psychologically different from a tank or a warehouse. A tank can run low. An industrial breathing system can drift. It can become noisier, dirtier, less efficient, less predictable. The crew would not only count oxygen mass, they would pay attention to the health of the whole atmospheric loop, because air on Titan is not something you possess once. It is something you keep successfully making. That is also why atmosphere management belongs near the center of the settlement story, rather than in the equipment appendix. If Titan cannot offer one safe breath outdoors, then every peaceful indoor conversation, every night's sleep, and every recovered patient already represents a victory of engineering over environment. Air is not the background in this documentary. It is the thing the habitat has to win again and again. That balance would be felt most clearly during interruptions. If recovery efficiency drops, if a contaminant appears, or if power has to be rerouted, the atmosphere inside the base can stop being human long before the walls themselves fail. On Earth, air is the great unnoticed background. On Titan, air would be the most carefully defended product the habitat makes. Every sleeping person, every working person, and every sick person would be trusting the same chain of machines to keep the invisible chemistry of life inside safe margins. NASA's recovery research also carries a second warning. Higher oxygen recovery is pursued because the easy path is not good enough for longer missions. If you are close to Earth, inefficiency can sometimes be paid for by resupply. Far away, inefficiency becomes mass, cost, and vulnerability. Titan sits in the part of the solar system where that vulnerability is no longer an edge case. It is part of the mission architecture from the beginning. So oxygen on Titan is not a crate of emergency consumables. It is a loop that has to be built, powered, repaired, and monitored indefinitely. And oxygen is only one loop. Water has its own, waste has its own, food has its own, heat crosses all of them. If you want to keep humans alive in a sealed world that gives them no breathable atmosphere, you end up chasing a phrase people love to use because it sounds elegant. Closed loop. On Titan, the phrase loses its elegance fast. Closed loop sounds like victory because it sounds complete. Say the words quickly and they suggest a settled machine. A clever system that reuses what it needs, wastes very little, and frees a habitat from dependence on constant shipments from Earth. That dream is not foolish. ESA's Melissa program and NASA's regenerative life support work exist because deep missions eventually need exactly that direction. But the research also makes something else clear. Closing loops is not a magic trick, it is a burden of interdependence. Melissa is a useful example because it shows the structure honestly. Different compartments handle waste, gas exchange, microbial processing, water recovery, and biological functions that influence one another. That is what closure means in practice, not one device. Many systems cooperating under narrow tolerances. When people say closed-loop habitat, they are really describing a chain of loops that only behaves cleanly if each part keeps performing and the interfaces between parts remain stable. NASA's long-duration life support literature adds the engineering weight. It keeps returning to the same cluster of burdens: mass, reliability, power, crew time, and long development effort. Food production does not stand alone. Oxygen recovery does not stand alone. Water recovery does not stand alone. The more tightly these processes are woven together, the more a local failure can spread into other needs. The reward is reduced resupply. The cost is complexity inside the habitat. Titan raises that cost because the outside world offers so little free correction. If a loop struggles in low Earth orbit, the crew is still close to Earth in time, knowledge, and in some cases future resupply pathways. If a loop struggles on Titan, the crew is living far from rapid help, under severe thermal pressure, inside an environment where venting or replacing mass casually is deeply expensive. The system has to carry more of its own mistakes, because the Moon offers no biosphere and little operational forgiveness. That is why the right emotional tone for closed loop on Titan is not triumph, it is discipline. A closed habitat is a place where yesterday's waste water has to become tomorrow's water again, where exhaled carbon dioxide may feed recovery systems, and where biological components and mechanical components share the same fragile volume. Every kilogram not resupplied is only avoided because another system has taken on the burden locally. This is good engineering if it works. It is still heavy engineering. Titan does not turn it into simplicity. NASA's papers on life support challenges and food production are especially helpful because they resist the clean fantasy of total closure. They speak about burdens, not slogans, lighting needs, biological reliability, power draw, incremental progress rather than instant replacement of delivered food. That language belongs in a serious survival film because it keeps people from hearing closed loop as a hand wave over the very systems that decide whether Titan remains survivable at all. That same research also reminds us that loops fail in ordinary ways before they fail in dramatic ones. Sensors can drift, a microbial balance can move the wrong way, a filter can degrade, water quality can change slowly enough that it takes skill to notice. On Titan, where importing replacements is costly and the outside world cannot support life directly, small degradations matter more. They accumulate inside the very systems meant to make distance survivable. So a closed habitat would need the culture of a ship, a laboratory, and a clinic at the same time. People would not only use systems, they would watch them, interpret them, and learn their moods. The loop has to be legible enough that a slow decline is caught before it spreads. That kind of vigilance is part of the true cost of closure. A machine that lets you rely less on Earth also demands that you know your own little world in exhausting detail. That demand becomes easier to respect when you remember that no loop in the habitat really stays in its lane. If water recovery slips, food production feels it. If crop biology drifts, air chemistry and waste handling may feel it. If maintenance gets postponed because a medical concern suddenly absorbs crew time, the postponed work does not disappear. It comes back later as a larger question inside the same closed environment. Titan turns interdependence from a nice systems word into a survival fact. The same is true of maintenance. A loop is not closed once and then forgotten. Pumps foul, sensors drift, biological systems fluctuate, filters saturate, interfaces corrode, habitats age. On Earth, many of those problems live inside huge support webs of spare parts, specialists, factories, and logistics. On Titan, they live inside the base. The base either knows how to keep them under control, or the base slowly stops being a place where humans can remain alive. This is one reason the phrase closed loop can sound cleaner than the lived reality it describes. The cleaner the slogan, the easier it is to miss the labor. Someone has to inspect, calibrate, clean, replace, diagnose, and decide. Closure saves mass only by turning more of the mission into ongoing local responsibility. Titan makes that responsibility heavier because the world outside never gives the crew a cheap reset. There is also a psychological consequence to that kind of responsibility. A crew in a highly closed habitat would live close to the meaning of every maintenance task. Cleaning a filter is not housekeeping. Calibrating a sensor is not paperwork. Delaying one inspection is not always harmless. Titan compresses the distance between routine discipline and survival in a way most terrestrial environments do not. That can make a settlement technically possible while keeping it mentally exhausting. That is why closure should sound heavy rather than elegant. Every kilogram saved on resupply may reappear as diagnostic workload, crew training, redundancy, or repair complexity inside the habitat. The loop closes only because the habitat has chosen to become more responsible for itself. Titan rewards that choice with less imported mass and punishes it with more ways for one local weakness to spread across several systems at once. So the elegant phrase has to be translated into a physical image. A Titan habitat is not a bubble with clever recycling. It is a small artificial environment where the main living systems are constantly negotiating with one another under conditions the outside world never stops trying to worsen. That is still not the full weight of the problem. Most people feel the remaining weight most clearly when the question becomes personal. How do you feed people there day after day, year after year, when the outside world offers no living food chain and almost no useful agriculture of its own? The image of a greenhouse in space is comforting for the same reason Titan is comforting. It takes a hard problem and gives it a familiar shape: rows of plants under glass, water lines, green leaves, light, maybe a small harvest. The picture feels manageable because agriculture on Earth is so normal that we forget how much normality it depends on. Soil ecology, sunlight, seasons, insect relationships, microbial balance, waste cycles, temperature stability, spare water, spare labor, and a whole planet smoothing out mistakes in the background. NASA's work on food production in space strips that comfort away. Bioregenerative systems are difficult because food is not just calories. Food production ties directly into water management, carbon dioxide use, oxygen production, waste handling, lighting, nutrient control, pathogen control, and crew time. A crop system is never merely a tray of plants. It is part of the life support architecture. Titan makes that architecture more demanding. First, the weak sunlight returns. A greenhouse on Titan cannot simply lean on the sky. The sky is dim, hazy, and cold. So if crops are grown, they likely depend heavily on artificial lighting and thermal stability supplied by the habitat's power budget. That means feeding people draws on the same scarce energy that must already keep water liquid, oxygen flowing, and medicine stored correctly. Calories begin competing directly with every other survival line in the ledger. Second, the outside temperature never lets the farming system become incidental. On Earth, if the power flickers in one building, the planet outside still carries life. On Titan, the farm would sit inside a machine within a machine. Lose heat, lose circulation, lose clean water, or lose contamination control, and the farming system can fail as quickly as any other biological system under stress. Once that happens, the consequences are not symbolic. They reach nutrition, morale, oxygen balance, and future independence from resupply. NASA's regenerative life support literature is careful here, and that care is worth preserving. Food production helps. It may support fresh nutrition and psychological health. It may integrate with other loops, but it is not yet a trivial replacement for stored food on long missions, and certainly not under the compounded burdens of Titan. The honest question is not, can plants grow there? The honest question is, can a warm, lit, cleaned, watered, nutrient-stable miniature ecosystem be sustained there continuously by a remote crew? That ecosystem would also consume time. Plants need watching, nutrients need adjusting, contamination needs catching early, hardware needs cleaning, harvesting needs labor, storage needs planning. On Earth, those tasks disappear into a civilization full of surplus land, sunshine, and specialization. On Titan, they come back into view as one more load carried by a small crew whose other systems are already demanding attention. Agriculture there is not a decorative touch of green. It is another mission-critical workplace. That is a far heavier question. It also changes how we hear the word agriculture. Farming on Titan would not feel like expanding into nature. It would feel like importing a tiny, carefully regulated fragment of Earth and persuading it not to fail. The plants would not be taking advantage of Titan's environment. They would be hiding from it entirely. Every leaf would depend on walls, pumps, lights, heat, and redundancy. And because the system would be small, every failure would feel large. Losing one crop cycle in a terrestrial civilization is a market problem. Losing one crop cycle inside a sealed outpost can become a nutrition problem, a morale problem, and a systems planning problem all at once. Fresh food matters. Psychological relief matters. Oxygen contribution may matter at the margin. Crew time invested in the farm matters too. A damaged tray or contaminated bay is not just lost produce, it is lost trust in one of the habitat's most delicate subsystems. This is why Titan's hydrocarbon wealth does so little for the food problem. Complex outside chemistry does not create a crop system. A crop system needs water in the right state, gases in the right balance, temperatures in the right range, microbes under control, and time free enough for the crew to tend it. The Moon offers almost none of that freely. The habitat has to generate it all internally, then preserve it against accident. That is also why the greenhouse image must be handled carefully. Green leaves behind glass can make a settlement feel almost peaceful. On Titan, those leaves would be the visible surface of one of the most resource-intensive parts of the whole base. They would be beautiful precisely because so much heat, energy, water, and attention had already been spent to make them possible. And the emotional importance of that would cut both ways. A successful crop room could steady morale because it makes life look alive again. A failing crop room could shake morale for the same reason. When the farm is one of the clearest signs that Earth has been partially rebuilt inside the base, any weakness there is felt not only in calories, but in confidence. And if the greenhouse succeeds, it still does not turn Titan itself into farmland. It only proves that a protected interior can impersonate a small piece of Earth for a while. That is an important distinction. The plants would not be adapting us to Titan. They would be helping us preserve distance from Titan. And if a crop system fails, the loss is not limited to calories. A failed plant room can also ripple into water quality, waste handling, oxygen balance, and morale. That is the hidden scale of food production in a remote habitat. The plants are not standing beside the life support system, they are inside it. Titan's cold and dimness make that integration more fragile, not less. The same is true of success. A healthy crop room would not simply mean fresh food on a plate. It would mean another subsystem that has to be kept warm, lit, watered, cleaned, and biologically stable through months and years of remoteness. Agriculture on Titan is less like building a farm in a valley and more like carrying a tiny climate, a tiny nutrient cycle, and a tiny piece of biosphere inside a pressure vessel. That is why the farm is never pastoral in this story. It is one more survival machine. It is easy at this point to lose sight of the body itself because the habitat is doing so much work in the story. But all of this machinery exists for one reason: to keep a human organism alive, and that organism is still going to live under Titan's gravity. Not Earth's, not even Mars. Titan's. Titan's gravity can sound gentle enough to become charming. NASA's Titan facts page places it at about 0.14 times Earth's gravity. In casual conversation, that number invites a picture of easy movement, long leaps, soft landings, less strain on joints, maybe a world where the body is relieved instead of burdened. But NASA's human research work on altered gravity pushes against that fantasy quickly. Bones, muscles, circulation, sensory motor systems, and broader physiological adaptation all depend on loading. Remove enough of that loading for long enough, and the body changes in ways that are not decorative. The important thing is not that Titan has low gravity, it is that we do not have evidence strong enough to call that gravity sufficient. NASA's Human Research Program is already cautious about the Moon and Mars. The Gravity Fields Hazard page and related literature treat partial gravity as an open medical concern, not a solved comfort upgrade. One especially useful NASA technical paper argues that even lunar gravity and Martian gravity may be insufficient to maintain long-term human health. That matters because Mars sits around 0.38 G, Titan sits far below that. So the safe scientific language is not optimistic. It is uncertain and likely risky. That uncertainty reaches ordinary life more deeply than the word gravity first suggests. Exercise equipment might help some systems, careful scheduling might help some systems, but none of that becomes proof that a person can live year after year at Titan's loading level without paying an accumulating cost in bone, muscle, balance, or circulation. The problem is not that no countermeasures exist. The problem is that we do not have evidence strong enough to say the countermeasures close the gap. That does not mean Titan gravity would be identical to microgravity. It would not. A person there would feel weight, move against weight, and live in a constant field rather than floating in freefall. NASA Ames' work on artificial gravity and biological protection suggests partial gravity can give partial benefits in some contexts. But partial benefit is not the same sentence as proven adequacy. Between those phrases lies the whole unresolved human experiment. That matters because it pulls the story back from habitat fantasy to biology. Imagine the best case so far. The air is made, the water loop works, the heat stays on, food grows indoors, power remains steady, the base is disciplined and repairable. Even then, the people inside are living year after year in a gravity regime far below anything the human species evolved in and below the levels already treated cautiously for Mars. The habitat may be functioning beautifully while the body quietly drifts away from the conditions it was built for. Bones do not care that Titan has thick air. Muscles do not care that rotorcraft flight is easier there. Circulation does not care that the surface may be better shielded than an airless world. The body responds to loading, movement, equilibrium, and time. If those inputs remain too low for too long, the organism pays. How much? Over what timescale? In which systems first? Those are exactly the uncertainties that make Titan unsuitable for easy settlement language. This is another place where a frontier story can turn misleading by sounding too cheerful. Low gravity is often presented as a convenience. On Titan, it may feel pleasant in the first minutes and become costly in the long run. The word gentle belongs to the sensation, it does not belong to the evidence. The most honest phrase here may be that a human resident of Titan would still be living inside a biological trial with no firm outcome. The habitat might protect them from vacuum, radiation peaks, and weather exposure. It could not prove in advance that their skeleton, muscles, cardiovascular system, or broader physiology would thrive under Titan's chronic underloading. That uncertainty matters because settlement is not the same thing as survival for a few dramatic months. It means asking whether people can heal well, work well, stay stable, remain strong enough for emergencies, and perhaps raise mission durations from years towards something more permanent. Titan gravity sits below the level where current evidence gives much comfort for those questions. A base could look successful from the outside, while the bodies inside it quietly absorb costs that are slow, cumulative, and hard to reverse. There is also a long return problem hidden inside this uncertainty. A crew that adapted to Titan's gravity would still need its bodies to remain functional enough for serious work, emergencies, and perhaps one day a return to stronger gravity elsewhere. If the low loading quietly erodes that resilience, the damage is not only local to Titan, it travels with the crew into every other phase of the mission. That is why low gravity cannot be treated as a pleasant feature and left there. Pleasant for whom and for how long? Pleasant on the first walk is not the same as adequate on year 5. A lighter body may feel graceful crossing the habitat. That says almost nothing about whether bone turnover, muscle maintenance, circulation balance, and long-term performance are remaining inside safe ranges. Titan gives sensation faster than it gives evidence. That mismatch between feeling and evidence is one of Titan's recurring lessons. The world can feel easier before it proves itself safer. It can feel gentler before it proves itself sustainable. Gravity participates in that illusion because the first report from a human visitor might sound almost joyful. The serious report would have to wait much longer. So gravity remains below the evidence, and that means even one of Titan's most attractive physical features cannot be counted as a solved advantage. At best, it is a possibility with unknown limits. At worst, it is another quiet way the world asks a human body to live outside the conditions that body knows how to survive. For us, that matters. Titan does offer one kind of ease here. Its dense atmosphere and low gravity are good for flying machines. That is true. It still does not mean settlement becomes easy. Dragonfly is one of the most revealing machines ever planned for Titan because it tells the truth about only part of the world. NASA describes the mission as a rotorcraft designed to use Titan's dense atmosphere and low gravity to move from site to site. That is a remarkable operational advantage. On some worlds, flight is punishing or impossible with comparable hardware. On Titan, the air and gravity create conditions that actually favor aerodynamic mobility. A machine can use that. Exploration can benefit from it. Science can reach more terrain because of it. This is real progress. It is also a narrow kind of progress. The same environment that helps a rotorcraft fly still forces a human outside in a sealed suit without breathable oxygen, under cryogenic cold, with hydrocarbons and haze all around them. A robot taking short-powered flights between science targets is not solving the human outdoor problem. It is solving a robotics mobility problem inside Titan's particular physics. Those are different achievements. That difference matters because frontier imagination likes to blur them together. If a world is easy to move through, maybe it is easy to work in. If machines can range widely, maybe settlements can spread. Titan resists that whole chain. The atmosphere helps lift, but it does nothing for lungs. Low gravity helps certain vehicles, yet it does not prove the human body thrives there. The surface may be navigable and still remain cold enough to punish every exposed operation. Think about what outdoor work would really mean. A person leaving a Titan habitat is not strolling into weather. They are entering an emergency that has been carefully stabilized by equipment. The suit must carry breathable atmosphere, thermal protection, communications, and enough endurance to cover the work period safely. Outdoor tools must survive the cold as well. Each return to the base passes through an airlock that costs time and heat, and each maintenance task exposes both the worker and the surrounding systems to a place where nothing can be done casually. The distinction between exploration and construction becomes especially sharp here. A flying robot can arrive at a site, gather data, and leave. A human settlement has to install hardware, inspect seals, recover damaged components, move mass, and repeat those tasks in all seasons of the mission. Titan may favor mobility in the narrow aerodynamic sense, while still making the heavy repetitive labor of settlement awkward, expensive, and risky. So ease of movement does not become ease of labor. In fact, mobility can hide labor by making the map look simple. If a rotorcraft can cross kilometers with elegance, the mind starts imagining a human settlement spreading across the same landscape with similar freedom. But a human site is heavy in a way a science aircraft is not. Habitats, spare parts, pressure systems, medical equipment, food infrastructure, and repair tools do not travel as lightly as instruments and cameras. Moving through Titan's air is one problem. Carrying a civilization through it is another. It also does not become ease of construction. Building habitats, running long external lines, replacing failed equipment, and recovering from accidents all depend on human operations that remain expensive and slow in such an environment. A rotorcraft may hop across dunes and frozen plains more elegantly than a rover on another world. That says little about whether a settlement crew can maintain infrastructure outdoors day after day without accumulating risk and thermal debt. And that maintenance debt is what turns a good exploration world into a difficult living world. Exploration tolerates pauses, settlement does not. A delayed science flight is disappointing. A delayed heater repair, seal replacement, or line inspection can threaten the conditions that keep everybody alive. Titan may reward mobile robots because they can exploit the atmosphere without asking the atmosphere to support life. Human settlement would ask for much more than movement, and Titan keeps saying no to most of those extra requests. So the right summary of Dragonfly is not that Titan is easy, it is that Titan is selectively easy. It is easy for one class of machine doing one class of work under a carefully designed power and thermal regime. Human settlement requires a wider yes from the world than Titan seems willing to give. That selective friendliness may be the cleanest way to describe the whole moon. Titan rewards particular robotic strategies and carefully designed hardware. Human biology does not receive the same kindness. Casual construction does not receive it either, and neither do the ordinary improvisations by which communities spread into hard landscapes on Earth. Dragonfly is therefore best understood as evidence of Titan's exploration value, not of its habitability. The mission proves the moon is scientifically rich and physically interesting enough to design around. It proves some machines can exploit Titan's atmosphere intelligently. It does not prove human life there becomes comfortable, routine, or scalable. That is why the moon can be good news for science and bad news for casual colonization language at the same time. A place that rewards robotic exploration can still punish human operations if every exterior task drags behind it a chain of suit preparation, thermal loss, airlock cycling, inspection and repair. Flight is a clue about Titan's air. It is not a verdict on Titan's livability. This is a useful correction because it lets Titan keep a genuine strength without letting that strength swallow the film. A serious documentary should not pretend all variables point in the same direction. Some really do point in Titan's favor. Flight conditions for certain vehicles are one of them. But a world can be excellent for robotic exploration and punishing for human presence at the same time. Antarctica teaches part of that lesson on Earth. Titan teaches it in a much harsher form. There is also a deeper reason mobility cannot rescue settlement. Movement only matters after the habitat already exists. It matters after air, heat, power, medicine, and food are stable enough to support people who want to move. A flying robot tells us that Titan's air density is useful. It tells us nothing about whether the closed living environment at the center of any settlement can stay alive over years of stress and delayed support. And delayed support is the next great pressure in the story. Because even if the habitat works, and even if the crew works, Titan is still far enough from Earth to change the meaning of help itself. When people imagine deep space danger, they often imagine the physical event first. A suit rupture, a power loss, a medical emergency. What distance does is change the time structure around every one of those events. NASA's "What time is it in space?" resource gives a simple number with enormous consequences. One-way light time between Earth and Saturn can run on the order of 74 to 84 minutes, depending on orbital positions. That means a message sent from Titan does not become part of a live conversation in any normal sense. Ask for guidance, and more than an hour passes before the question even arrives. Receive an answer, and another long stretch passes before it reaches you. That delay changes more than conversation. It changes supervision. No one on Earth can watch a repair and interrupt in time. No one can guide a medical procedure minute by minute as though they were standing nearby. Checklists, training, onboard diagnostics, and local judgment all become more important because the speed of light has already decided that Earth will always be late to the room. That delay alone does not kill anyone. The way it changes decision-making can. Near Earth, the public image of spaceflight still includes mission control voices, rapid troubleshooting, and teams on the ground thinking with the crew almost in step. NASA's deep space medical and operations literature moves away from that image deliberately. Programs focused on Earth-independent medical operations and exploration medical capability are built around the reality that far missions cannot expect immediate ground help. Crews must diagnose, stabilize, and decide locally far more often because the physics of distance forces them to. Titan lives squarely inside that reality. Now put that into the habitat we have been building through the last few problems. Suppose a life support subsystem fails in a subtle way. Suppose a crew member becomes seriously ill. Suppose a contamination event appears in the farm loop or the water loop. Suppose a thermal control problem begins cascading through several compartments. Earth still matters. Expertise on Earth still matters. But Earth is no longer present in the rhythm of the emergency. The people on Titan are the first responders, the continuing responders, and for a long time the only responders. That is what distance does. It turns consultation into correspondence. That change reaches ordinary human behavior faster than we sometimes admit. On Earth, when something strange happens, one of the first instincts is to call, send, ask, or hand the problem to a larger system. On Titan, the crew would still do that, but the answer would arrive on a different emotional timescale. The first hour belongs to the people already inside the habitat. The next hour may belong to them too. By the time Earth is meaningfully part of the event, local decisions may already have shaped the outcome. NASA's XMC materials make this feel practical rather than cinematic. Deep space crews need onboard capability, onboard reasoning, onboard tools, and procedures that do not assume a fast back and forth with Earth. The problem is not only communication delay, it is the accumulation of delay across uncertainty. You send a symptom report, time passes. A reply comes back asking for more data. More time passes, an answer arrives. More time passes before the answer can even be tested. If the situation is moving quickly, that rhythm is simply too slow. That is why distance also changes what competence means. A Titan crew would not just need bravery or technical skill. It would need enough judgment to notice which problems are still questions and which have already become actions. The habitat cannot wait politely for certainty if the cost of waiting is rising every minute. Delayed rescue turns local interpretation into part of life support. That is especially true for compounded events. A thermal problem may become a medical problem because a crew member has to work harder or stay suited longer. A medical question may become a systems question because treatment draws on power, sterile water, diagnostics, or crew attention that were already under pressure. Earth can still advise on all of that, it just cannot arrive inside the first wave of the event. The first wave belongs to the habitat itself. This is why distance belongs inside the habitability question, not outside it as mission flavor. A remote habitat is not merely a faraway house. It is a house in which every important failure has to be survived locally for long enough that Earth can become useful again. That reality changes redundancy, training, operational caution, and the amount of medical autonomy the crew has to carry. It also changes the emotional meaning of every emergency, because there is no hidden nearby web of help ready to lean in. Distance also changes what counts as a minor problem. A leak that might be routine near Earth becomes serious sooner when advice, spare parts, and backup decisions all travel slowly. A symptom that might trigger quick specialist support at home becomes something the crew has to interpret alone for hours before outside guidance can even begin to contribute. Titan stretches every uncertainty long enough that the habitat must become more self-knowing than ordinary human settlements ever need to be. That self-knowledge is its own survival system. Crews would need to know the normal sound of pumps, the normal timing of procedures, and the normal behavior of their own bodies well enough to notice trouble before Earth had even heard the first question. Rescue also begins to thin out conceptually. Even when we avoid unsourced rescue timelines, the structure of the problem is plain. Titan is farther than Mars' orbit and far beyond the Moon. Help cannot be pictured as merely delayed by bureaucracy or fuel constraints. The habitat has to assume that the first answer to almost any serious problem is internal. That is a heavy sentence. It becomes heavier when the problem is not mechanical but biological. Because a settlement can improvise around some equipment failures better than it can improvise around an injured or sick human body. And on Titan, medicine cannot live as an afterthought, it has to live inside the base from the beginning. That is the real delay tax. A remote habitat is often imagined as an engineering object first and a human place second. Titan does not let that ordering survive. NASA's work on autonomous medical care for exploration-class missions is valuable because it says the quiet part out loud. Deep missions cannot rely on the full terrestrial care system. They cannot count on fast evacuation. They cannot count on rich resupply of specialized equipment and consumables. As missions move farther from Earth, medicine becomes a design problem that has to be built into the mission architecture rather than attached later as a kit of supplies. That statement reaches all the way into the Titan question. If a crew lives there, the base is not only an air plant and a furnace, it is also a clinic. Maybe a limited one, maybe a highly constrained one, but it must contain diagnostic capability, treatment supplies, trained judgment, and decision support strong enough to operate through long communication delays, and without the assumption that Earth can take the patient back quickly. The habitat has to carry not only the conditions for life, but part of the care structure that protects life when it begins to fail. NASA's exploration medical capability papers underline the same point from a systems angle: lack of evacuation opportunity, delayed communication, limited consumables, and constrained resources all push mission design toward more local autonomy. A Titan base would feel those pressures sharply, because every other burden we have already named competes with medicine for the same things: mass, volume, power, heat, storage, maintenance attention, crew training time. Medical capability therefore includes more than bandages and drugs. It includes imaging if possible, sterile procedure space if possible, enough diagnostics to distinguish one danger from another, and enough training that a crew can act before certainty arrives from Earth. Even if every future solution is not yet known, the direction is clear. Titan would force medicine to become a resident part of the habitat's architecture, rather than an emergency locker opened only on bad days. Medicine therefore becomes expensive in the same way food becomes expensive, not because healthcare is optional, but because the habitat has to recreate another Earth function inside a sealed machine. And medicine has a cruel feature that the other systems do not always share. When it is needed, it is often needed under stress, ambiguity, and time pressure. A water loop can sometimes be isolated and studied. A sick or injured crew member may be declining while the crew is still deciding what the data means. That forces the medical layer of the habitat to be not only capable but ready. Supplies, diagnostics, sterile procedure, and crew confidence all have to exist before the bad day starts. Think about the difference between getting hurt near Earth and getting hurt near Titan. Near Earth, there are still long odds and severe constraints, but the surrounding civilization remains conceptually close. Specialists exist in real time, hospitals exist, supply chains exist. On Titan, a serious medical event unfolds in a place where the crew may already be managing life support, thermal control, food systems, and equipment reliability under difficult conditions. Treatment is not only a matter of knowing what to do, it is a matter of having brought the ability to do it, maintained it, and preserved enough spare capacity that the act of caring for one failing body does not destabilize the rest of the small world, keeping everyone alive. There is a moral weight here as well. A remote crew would have to live with the knowledge that some levels of care available on Earth may remain impossible to reproduce fully. That does not make the mission meaningless. It does make the settlement claim more serious than frontier language usually allows. Titan would ask people to bring not just tools and medicine, but accepted limits on what medicine can become that far from the institutions that normally sustain it. That is one more reason a serious Titan habitat would feel less like a pioneer outpost and more like a carefully defended enclave. It would carry air, heat, food, and medicine in the same moral frame, not as conveniences, but as parts of a temporary civilization that can survive only if it keeps rebuilding itself correctly. That acceptance changes the emotional geometry of the base. The clinic is not only a room of equipment, it is a reminder that civilization has edges, and that one of those edges has been brought with the crew to Saturn's system. Titan can be explored under that condition. It is much harder to call it a natural home under that condition. This is another way Titan punishes the habit of thinking in one variable at a time. A warm habitat is not enough. Breathable air is not enough. Adequate calories are not enough. Human survival includes the ability to respond when bodies go off script. Infection, injury, stress, chronic decline, equipment-related accidents, and unexpected physiological effects of low gravity all belong inside the ledger. A place far from Earth has to be more medically self-contained, or it is not truly survivable, and self-contained medicine brings its own maintenance burden. Supplies expire, sterile conditions have to be preserved, equipment has to be tested, training has to be refreshed before panic arrives. Titan turns care into another long-duration system that must stay ready even when nothing dramatic is happening. The clinic, like the oxygen loop, must work on quiet days so that it can work on terrible ones. The research does not tell us that medicine on Titan is impossible. It tells us that medicine there is another deep layer of artificiality, another part of Earth that has to be imported and kept functioning minute by minute. Another reason the base becomes denser with responsibilities than settlement art usually admits. You can hear the pattern by now. Titan softens a few outer hazards and deepens the inner dependence on systems. Medicine is one of the clearest examples because it reveals how far the habitat must go beyond shelter. It has to defend against the world outside and carry enough of civilization inside that a crew can continue living when the unexpected happens. And once medicine joins the air system, the water system, the food system, the power system, and the thermal system inside one small base, a final question starts to dominate. How often can Earth still save it? Or, more honestly, how rarely can it afford to need saving at all? That question never really leaves. By the time we reach this point, Titan no longer looks like one problem. It looks like a burden that keeps layering itself. NASA's human body and space materials keep returning to a simple truth about deep exploration. The farther a mission moves from Earth, the more it must bring with it and the more it must learn to operate without ordinary support. That truth can sound logistical and dull until you lay Titan's requirements beside it. A Titan base has to create air, hold on to water, control waste, preserve food, maintain heat, stabilize power, carry medical capability, and store repair tools before something breaks, not after. None of those burdens cancels another. They stack. And the stacking matters more than any individual technology headline. A settlement proposal can sound persuasive if each line is considered alone. Better recycling here, better crops there, better local manufacturing later, better autonomy everywhere. But the crew does not get to live inside those promises one by one. It lives inside their overlap. If each improvement comes with extra hardware, extra heat load, extra maintenance, extra training, or extra dependence on another subsystem, then the real question is not whether each tool works. The real question is whether the whole package remains governable over time. That is why the final verdict of Titan is really a verdict about resupply and self-sufficiency. Closed-loop research from NASA and ESA exists because carrying everything forever stops making sense on very long missions. But the same research also shows that reducing resupply means increasing internal system burden. You avoid importing one stream of mass only by building a more capable and more complex habitat. That trade is manageable in principle. Titan then adds its own pressure through weak sunlight, cryogenic cold, uncertain low-gravity biology, delayed guidance, an unbreathable atmosphere, difficult outdoor work, and the absence of any natural food web. So each act of self-sufficiency must happen in a place that already punishes failure. That means local fabrication and repair can help, but they do not magically erase dependence. A workshop inside the base might turn out brackets, housings, or simple seals. That is useful. It is not the same as reproducing the full chain of delicate valves, sterile medical stock, sensor packages, crop chemistry, and electronics that a living habitat slowly consumes. The farther the settlement moves toward independence, the more carefully it has to decide which dependencies can truly be reduced, and which remain tied to Earth for much longer than frontier language likes to admit. This is where the common argument, every individual challenge looks technically solvable, begins to wobble. Yes, individually, many parts of the Titan problem can be imagined. Engineers can design power systems and insulated habitats. Life support teams can improve oxygen recovery and water recycling. Agronomy and medical planning can push controlled crops and autonomy farther than they are today. None of those sentences is ridiculous. The problem is that Titan asks for all of them at once, for long durations, with limited outside correction. In a world that contributes little direct help to any of them, a settlement there would therefore live or die by its tolerance for accumulated dependence. That dependence includes resupply in the literal sense. Certain consumables would still come from Earth for a very long time, and some specialized parts would remain difficult to replace locally. When a failure hit a loop already pushed toward closure because routine imports were too expensive or too slow, the whole habitat would feel it. Even if the base became impressive, it would still be leaning on the fact that another world built it, launched it, and kept feeding it expertise and hardware across immense distance. This is the point where separate challenges stop sounding separate. Weak sunlight leaks into the heating budget, then into farming, storage, and repair timing. Thin evidence for low-gravity health reaches into labor, emergency response, and long-term settlement confidence. Distance stretches every failure because every failure has to live longer without outside intervention. Titan's burden comes from the way these pressures reinforce one another until the habitat feels less like a collection of systems and more like one stressed organism. This is why the most honest final image of a Titan habitat is not a frontier town. It is a continuously repaired Earth machine. That phrase also helps with scale. Frontier stories often treat self-sufficiency as a horizon you simply move toward. Titan suggests something rougher. You may reduce some categories of import while increasing local complexity so much that the base becomes more dependent on its own flawless operation. A habitat that makes more of its own air, water, and food is impressive. It is also a habitat with more loops that can drift, more equipment that can age, and more local failure modes that Earth cannot reach quickly. That is why the final burden does not feel like one last engineering challenge waiting at the end of the list. It feels like the weight of every earlier challenge refusing to stay separate. Resupply becomes the verdict because resupply measures how much of Earth still has to keep arriving after all the cleverness, all the recycling, all the local processing, and all the heroic design have already been counted. That final measure is sobering because it is the least romantic one. It does not ask whether the first habitat can land or whether the first crew can survive a season. It asks whether support can continue year after year and whether Earth can keep paying the hidden bill without interruption. Titan makes that hidden bill impossible to ignore. That is why resupply becomes more than logistics. It becomes a verdict on honesty. However elegant the design sounds and however impressive the first achievements are, the surviving question remains the same. How much of Earth still has to keep coming with you, materially or institutionally, for the settlement to go on being a place where people can wake up tomorrow? Titan's answer seems to be a great deal. And that answer does not make the mission trivial or pointless. It makes it expensive in the deepest sense of the word. Money is part of that, but so are maintenance, attention, industrial continuity, training, patience, and the willingness of one world to keep supporting a tiny imitation of itself on another. Picture a crew opening a crate years into the settlement and finding not triumph, but another reminder of dependence, a part that could not be made locally, a medicine that expired, a specialist tool needed once again. Titan does not merely ask whether we can arrive, it asks whether we can afford to keep arriving over and over in the form of support. That image matters because it pulls the question out of abstract planning language. Somewhere inside the habitat, a person would be waiting on that crate while a pump kept running, crops kept needing attention, and everybody kept hoping the delayed shipment contained exactly the right replacement. The settlement would not fail only in spectacular ways. It could also fail through attrition, through one missing component that turns routine maintenance into accumulated risk. The phrase matters because it names what the habitat is really doing. The base would not be living on Titan in the ordinary sense. It would be carrying a shrinking but still essential fragment of Earth into a place that never becomes naturally kind. Every wall, every reserve tank, every medical locker, and every maintenance shelf would be standing in for planetary support that Earth provides for free. That does not make Titan meaningless as a destination, quite the opposite. It makes the moon scientifically fascinating and philosophically clarifying. Titan is where the difference between exploration and habitation becomes hard to ignore. We can want to know it, reach it, fly through its air, study its chemistry, and maybe even keep people alive there one day under extreme support. Those are real ambitions. What Titan resists is the softer fantasy that survival there would emerge naturally once the first steps were taken. The first steps would be the easy part compared with the long maintenance of life. That is the verdict hidden inside Resupply. The measure is not a single shipment, one rescue, or one successful landing. It is the continuing burden of keeping a tiny artificial Earth alive, far from the real one. And that brings us back to the image that started this film. Titan really does look less dead than many other worlds people talk about reaching. It has a sky, it has weather, it has pressure at the surface. It has lakes, rain, and a horizon softened by orange haze. NASA's Titan Facts page is not wrong to describe a moon with a dense atmosphere and active chemistry. If you stood there in imagination alone, Titan might feel closer to Earth than the moon ever could. It might even feel, for a moment, as if the worst parts of space had already been taken away. Some of them have. Titan's pressure means you are not dealing with vacuum at the surface. Its thick atmosphere likely gives better shielding than an airless world. Its low gravity and dense air create unusually favorable conditions for flying machines like Dragonfly. Those are not fake advantages. They are real. A serious answer has to grant them. But a serious answer also has to ask what humans actually need in order to survive for longer than a dramatic first moment. They need breathable oxygen. Titan does not give it. They need warmth that can be maintained every hour. Titan sits near 94 Kelvin and never relaxes. They need abundant usable energy. Titan lives under weak sunlight and punishes every shortage twice, once in power and once in heat. They need water in a form that can be processed without heroic cost, food that comes from living systems rather than raw chemistry, and gravity that is more than intuitively pleasant. Titan offers none of those freely. Even its richest chemistry leads back toward prebiotic science, not toward an edible ecosystem. Then the deeper human requirements arrive. A habitat far from Earth must recover oxygen, close water and waste loops, protect medicine, carry spares, grow at least some food, and survive long delays in communication and help. NASA's work on human hazards, autonomous medical care, and regenerative life support all point in the same direction. Distance does not merely separate a crew from home, it forces the habitat to absorb more of civilization's work internally. On Titan, that work has to happen inside a sealed, warm machine surrounded by a world that cannot forgive a lapse. So could humans survive on Titan? In the narrowest physical sense, probably yes, if the support system were extreme enough, resilient enough, and never allowed to fail for long. A person could be kept alive there inside a habitat that manufactured air, guarded heat, recycled water, grew or stored food, carried medical autonomy, and accepted that Earth was no longer close in any practical way. But that answer is not the same as saying Titan is hospitable. Titan solves the wrong problems first. It softens some outer hazards while leaving the inner survival stack brutally exposed. It looks friendly at the level of image and unforgiving at the level of biology. It helps where people already know to be afraid, then becomes harsher where the body and the habitat are least able to compromise. That is why Titan remains such a powerful place to think with. It is not a secret second Earth. It is not a near-term human home. It is a world that forces us to ask what survival actually means once scenery stops misleading us. If people ever stand there, the achievement will not be that Titan finally turned kind. The achievement will be that human engineering, discipline, and cooperation became strong enough to keep a small island of Earth alive inside a place that never stopped being alien. That is a noble ambition. It is just not the same ambition as finding a world ready for us. A person might live there only by rebuilding much of Earth inside a machine that never gets to forget where it came from. And that machine would have to keep working,